Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today is Brian and myself, and we have a special guest, Rachel Gregory, on the show with us. I'm going to let Rachel give herself a brief introduction, and then we're going to get into what we've been up to for the past week.
Hey guys, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Brief intro. I'll try to be brief. My name is Rachel Gregory. I am a nutritionist, and I never know how to start this off in terms of the intro, but I grew up playing sports my whole life. Super into just everything physical activity. Started getting more into nutrition as I went into college. Got my undergrad in athletic training and realized that that's not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. When I was towards the end of that program, decided to go on to grad school and pursue nutrition a little bit more, pursue exercise physiology. So I got my master's in nutrition and exercise physiology in grad school. In that program, I had to do a thesis study, so I ended up doing the first study looking at the ketogenic diet in non-elite CrossFit athletes, and that kind of propelled me into the world of low-carb keto diets. And this was back in 2016 was when I graduated. The study got published 2017, and so from then on, I kind of just dove into all things keto nutrition and started making a lot of mistakes for myself, started working with clients, learning through experiments, learning through all of that stuff, and then kind of propelled me into this kind of topic of metabolic flexibility, which is what I speak on a lot now and help a lot of clients, specifically women who have, gone through the keto low carb space, kind of transition them to more of a metabolically flexible lifestyle, or just kind of a little bit more balance in there. And then over the past few years, I've really gotten into a lot of training in terms of really just diving into muscle building and working with clients, especially women, to help them change their body composition and helping them realize that it's not just about the nutrition side of things, but the training side of things and how they kind of exist together, and really ways to optimize that. And so, yeah, hopefully that was a pretty good intro.
That was great. It's super interesting. I love the journey, and we have a bunch of questions that I think are going to be right up your alley in regarding kind of the training of yourself and the women that you work with and the nutrition associated with that. So I'm excited to dive into that. But let's hear about your week first, Straker. What's going on with you?
So not much very new with me, but one thing I will say. So last week we kind of talked about remembering John Meadows in that in that topic that we covered, and I was kind of thinking, I was, you know what, maybe as like a little bit of a lengthier thing for me, I'll just pick up one of his programs and run it as like a bridge program until I get to my next thing, because I've been doing a lot of high volume and I've been pushing that for a while. So I was like, let me switch it. Calories are coming up now, food's coming up. Let me try a low volume, higher intensity one. And I know for myself, it would be harder to write this because I generally tend to err on the side of higher volume because that's just what I've always done it and like. So I'm like, let me just buy something, support him, his family type of deal, and I'll get something new anyway. So I'm really enjoying it. It's been fun. It's been cool. I'm in and out of the gym pretty quick, like 50 minutes, 55 minutes. And I'm like ready to be done at that point. So it's a lot of just like intensity techniques. But it has been really, really cool. My calves were stupid freaking sore for like 4 days after just like 2 sets of calves. Even though I trained them regularly, which I thought was really interesting. And I'm excited just to spend, like doing like a bridge program. Like I said, just something fun where it's more fun based as opposed to like, okay, I'm really trying to like beat these things week over week, like my traditional training. So just like kind of a mental step back and just swing for the fences for a little bit, have some fun, learn some new things, see how far I can push myself with some of the pain thresholds, and I've been enjoying it so far.
That's awesome. I'm super into this, and I'm going to ask you more about it off air because I'm intrigued by this. Cool. Well, in my week, not a whole lot, except that I finally got to the 185 number on the scale. So 185.6 yesterday, 185.8 today. That ties the low from my last cut in 2020, where I got all those like cool pics in front of the mountains and stuff like that. So really hyped to be here and still feeling pretty good. And I know it's going to suck the last 3 or 4 pounds, but got to get through that in the next month and change and keep the train rolling. Rachel, what has been up in your last week?
Oh man, last week, what is today, Tuesday? So I actually was in Key West the weekend before last at a bachelorette party. And so last week was just getting back into the groove of things, recovering. I'm definitely like not a partier anymore. So I don't drink that much. I don't go out that much. I'm just a grandma. So that whole like 4 days in Key West, staying out till pretty late and all of that was just like really not used to that. So yeah, just recovering, getting back into work, recording podcasts, getting back into clients, all that stuff. So
cool. Well, Rachel, when you kind of made the transition out from like the functional fitness CrossFit type space into this more like evidence-based physique space, who were kind of some of the influences? Who were the first people and the stuff that you read that kind of got you started on that journey?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So I would say that really just diving into like going from the CrossFit world into, like you said, the bodybuilding world, I guess. I think one of the first books I read to just get me, into the education side of things was the Muscle and Strength Pyramid. So that was a huge foundation. I think also just I had hired a coach. So I came from the CrossFit kind of area. I actually got injured. And so that's what basically forced me to stop overdoing things, which tends to be the case for a lot of people, especially a lot of women I work with, type A personality, thinking, more is better, not paying attention to recovery. You end up kind of just burning out and then eventually having some type of injury that forces you to stop. So that's kind of where I was at, and getting into more of like the bodybuilding style of training and just going back to a Globo gym. I knew that I needed to have kind of a little bit more of an outside source. So I actually hired my own coach who helped me through that transition. And so with that, hiring my own coach and just learning from him and then diving more into, like I said, the bodybuilding side of things, like just doing more research in general, listening to more podcasts for people that were in the space, and just really just diving in, learning as much as I could, and then kind of taking that over the years. I've been recently, the last year or so, really diving into like the N1 training and nutrition. Those guys are amazing. I'm actually have a different coach now who I'm learning a lot from. I don't know if you guys know the guys and gals over at Physique Development. Mm-hmm. So yeah. Alex Bush is now my current coach. So I'm learning a lot from him, which is awesome. So yeah, it's really just kind of combination of diving into, books and research, but also the practical side of things and working with coaches in that realm to kind of learn their styles and adopt them, and work them into my own style of programming and training.
Yeah, totally. That's awesome. I love that. Muscle and Strength Pyramids are a fantastic resource. And I love that they're doing the N1 stuff because we reference a lot of the work that they do on this podcast.
Yeah, we talk about the N1 stuff a lot. It's been like one of the more recent things in my own like journey that's just like, it's like I opened a whole new set of doors that I didn't even know existed before, which was really cool.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a whole different, there's just so much. Like there's so much to train. Sometimes like at some point you can definitely get overwhelmed. Like, oh my gosh, like I thought this was how you're supposed to do it, and then you're like, well, there's not really one way to do it. There's just different ways that you can optimize different things. And especially I think it also really depends on like your, like where you're at, right? So like if you are like a beginner, intermediate, advanced, like that is going to play into a lot of it. So
that's a really good point to bring up. Yeah, I don't think exercise execution type stuff, but I really don't think the beginner needs to be overly concerned with like, is this overloading the lengthen versus the shorten right deal. Okay. So yeah. Moving on a little bit, is there anything that you've noticed like in your own kind of journey subjectively, like that has been like beneficial, in terms of like your physique, your recovery, and even mental acuity as you switch from the more like super high intensity functional fitness CrossFit style of training to more of this like physique style that you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say probably the number one thing that I definitely pay way more attention to now, and especially the last few years, and that transition, and that I really encourage my clients and make sure that they're paying attention to, is the recovery side of things, and just realizing like doing more is usually in most cases, and for most women especially, like I said, who have kind of that go mentality, and they're like, okay, if this is good, then more is better. So getting like completely away from that and realizing that, like, especially when it comes to changing your physique, and actually optimizing what you need to be optimizing, in that case, it's really more tends to not be better, for most people, especially a lot of the clients that I work with and with myself. Coming from that CrossFit background, it was always like, you didn't really feel like you got a good workout unless you were, dead on the floor making whatever, a sweat angel at the end of every session. Yeah. Whereas like now, and just thinking back to the last few years, like I can't even remember like feeling like I was dead. Maybe there's some sessions and some phases that I would go through. Like right now I'm actually in a metabolic stimulus phase, which we can go into or not, because that is more advanced. But, besides that, like I never really like feel like I'm completely dead after a workout. And I don't think that should be the goal. For a lot of people, especially if your main goal is to, change your physique, right? If we're talking about body composition, we're talking about building muscle, like you don't need to be dead after every workout. You need to have, good intensity. You need to be working hard during your workouts. You need to be, following structure, progression, all of that stuff, but you shouldn't feel like you have to be dead on the floor, after every single session. And then also kind of like chasing that sweat and chasing that, cardio burn, or whatever you want to call it. So I think recovery is the biggest thing, like focusing a lot more on that, not, training. Like I would go to CrossFit like 6 times a week, literally. And I was just like completely burnt out, completely just not paying attention to like the signals my body was sending me, right? And that's why I ultimately got injured and had to just completely stop. So training, 3 to 4 times per week, I mean, more than 4 times per week for most people is just like not necessary. Especially with a lot of the women that I work with too. It's like, we don't need to be training 6 times a week. It's just probably doing you more harm than good, because you're just not giving your body time to recover. And then in terms of building muscle, in that sense, a lot of people, and I talk about this all the time, and I'm sure you guys do too, like building muscle doesn't come from like what you're doing in the gym, right? You're breaking down your muscles when you're working out. You're building the actual muscle, during your recovery. And so if you're not recovering, you're just kind of going through this endless cycle that's like you work really, really hard and you're not getting the results that you think you should be getting. And obviously there's different facets to that with nutrition and all of that. So I think recovery would be the biggest thing. And then also I think there's so many different things, but I would say one more thing is just, like I kind of mentioned, especially coming from the CrossFit background, is like always feeling like I'm exercising to burn calories. And this is what I see with a lot of my clients as well. It's like we're focused so much on like that calorie burn or like that sweat and just chasing that feeling, versus like if our actual goal is to build muscle and change our physique, like you don't want to be, this is a saying I used to say, I say it a lot, I haven't said it in a while, but exercise to build, not to lose, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're training, you're training to build muscle, if that's the main goal, not to burn calories, right? If that's where your head's at, then we need to shift that and realize that that is going to be a lot more inefficient. It's not going to get you to the result that you want. So it's kind of changing that mindset and like really educating my clients on that, because again, those are just mistakes that I've made in the past, and see a lot of women making them as well. So
yeah, for sure. I always say that if you can leave your workout feeling like locally in the muscle very fatigued, but feeling systemically still like kind of with it, and you can just kind of like hobble up the stairs and then go sit down and start working again, then that's kind of the stimulus that we're after, versus that like systemic beat down where you're literally just spending the next 30 minutes trying to gather yourself. And then yeah, we all have experienced that, so I thought that was just a interesting point that you made as well.
Yeah. So, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to get into the next thing if you have anything to add.
No, go ahead.
Okay, cool. So as you kind of transitioned out of CrossFit, I'm curious for you personally, because, in CrossFit, I was the strongest that I ever was because it was kind of just about this idea of moving from point A to point B. But when you get into the physique space, the objective kind of changes from moving load to moving load within the spectrum of the biomechanics that you're looking to utilize optimally to target a muscle. So how did that look for you? Like, did you initially kind of come out of CrossFit and were you surprised at how much the weight that you were using was less? Did it hurt your ego? Was it hard? Was there like a transition period there where you weren't actually like moving correctly because you still were attached to these numbers from CrossFit?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it definitely was like a lot. Like I would say like probably the first year of coming out of CrossFit and going more into that, global bodybuilding gym, it was a big transition. I would say also I just wasn't really, I was still in that mindset of like moving from point A to point B, right? Like, let me, lift as much as I can. I wasn't really in that. And I guess this was also just because the education side of things, like I wasn't educated. I hadn't dove really far into, like hypertrophy training, all of that back then. So I think that was a piece of it as well. But yeah, I was definitely like ego was there, lifting as much as possible, doing, even though I had my own coach, I was still, some of the exercises that I was choosing, like I was still trying to, like, I think I spent a year like back squatting, like barbell back squatting, when I probably could have spent that year doing something a lot more beneficial for my personal biomechanics and anatomy. So I haven't barbell back squatted in like probably a year. I've been doing hack squats and like incorporating that. Also, I think I was still a lot in that mindset, and this probably came more so from my athletic training background, where we're kind of taught that using machines I guess we're taught at least I was taught this, like using machines is mostly for people who are recovering from injuries. Like you shouldn't use machines because you're not getting, the other stability that you need. And so that I kind of avoided those for a while. And now I guess it's kind of like the complete opposite. Like I barely use a barbell anymore. Like I use maybe, more so use like the hex bar to do RDLs and stuff. But I think the only movement that I probably use a barbell for is like RDLs right now, if I can. So yeah, there's just like so many different, things that I learned along the way, but definitely took a long time to kind of transition from, okay, I need to lift as much as possible, get from point A to point B versus, okay, what's my actual goal? My goal is to, stimulate my muscle to progress. And I need to do that in a way that is, am I executing properly? Am I setting myself up to execute properly? Am I getting the stimulus that I want? Do I have intention behind what I'm doing? Like, am I paying attention to every single rep and every single set? And like, am I giving myself enough time to rest? That's a huge thing. Like, oh my gosh, like I see women still, and I used to do this too, like, doing, I don't know, jumping jacks in the middle of their back squat sets. Like, what? It's just, oh my gosh. So yeah, there's so many different things, but those would be a few. Your journey reflects our journey very closely.
It does. Okay, so kind of I want to transition the conversation more into our main theme for the episode today, and that's hypertrophy, specifically targeting not like specifically targeting women, but like specifically speaking against like the female physiology. So as a coach, right, as a female yourself, tons of experience being a girl, and then working with of course, a lot of clients are women as well. Is there what are some of the main differences you would say in the way that training, I guess, could be approached or potentially should be approached for training women specifically?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So I think kind of the overall answer to this question, and I'll dive into my reasoning why, is that I don't think there is and should be much of a difference between males and females when we're looking at training. Yes, there are, like if we're looking from an anatomy standpoint and a physiology standpoint, like anatomy standpoint for women, yes, we have, like you hear people talk about, we have wider hips, Q angle, narrower shoulders. So things with that can change. But when someone says that and says how we should be kind of using different exercises or movements in that standpoint than a male, I kind of scratch my head and say, okay, well, within each female, like we may have wider hips or narrower shoulders, but we are all our own individual as well. So like one female could have way wider hips than another female, right? And then same with like a male, like their anatomy is set up differently as well. And so this kind of goes back to just looking at the individual and saying, okay, it's not about male versus female. It's about you as an individual. Like what is your anatomy? Like what are your biomechanics? How can you set yourself up in terms of like your exercise selection and like how you're training to get the most success out of that. So I think that looking at it from a male versus female standpoint is just kind of like missing the mark when it comes to that side of things. And then when it comes to like the physiology side of things, yes, we know that, males can have more force production or power, and there's research behind that. And there's research behind maybe females being a little bit more fatigue resistant and can handle a little bit more volume. We have some research in that regard. And I think that we're also missing the mark there because, again, it also goes back to the individual in terms of how much they can handle in their training. And that will go back to what their overall lifestyle is like, what their overall stress load is, how much they're training. And that is more so an individual, again, standpoint versus a male versus female. And then with the other side of physiology, we also have, like obviously women have cycles during the month, and we go through different stages of our life, right? So getting into like perimenopause, menopause, all of that. Those are definitely considerations, and there's, certain things within that, you probably hear, training during your cycle. There's different parts of your cycle that you can optimize different aspects of your training or like your nutrition. So for example, some people have probably heard like for a woman as they go through their cycle, there's certain periods of their cycle where they can, where they will be more, insulin sensitive, so they can, handle more carbs, or there's periods where they'll be more insulin resistant. So they should lower the carbs. And same with like training, there's periods where you could be, more prone to injury, right? And then there's periods throughout your cycle where you can handle more intensity and all of those things. And I think just from, the research standpoint, there is some research with that, but from a practical standpoint and from just what I've seen with my clients and working with many, many women over the years, that research doesn't necessarily translate into the individual, because I've seen some women, it's like the complete opposite of what that is. And it's just like very, very individualized in that sense. And then I think that also just goes back to the overall lifestyle within them. So like with their overall stress load, with all that. So with all that being said, I think that differences between men and women when it comes to training is, there's definitely some considerations, but I think that it all just needs to be more so individualized based off of like where that person's at and how those different things are affecting them. So did that answer your question?
That was a super good answer.
Okay.
Yeah. So with that in mind, that now there isn't like that much difference and we still need to pay attention to the individual, how often do you come across the issue with women not pushing close enough to failure or lifting heavy enough weight to truly create the adaptations that they're after? And are there still any misconceptions that you regularly encounter around women training hard?
Yeah. So again, I think this all just comes back to like looking at, what they're doing. And I think there is, this kind of overarching fear that women have of, lifting. I feel like we've gotten away from this, at least in my eyes, the last few years. But the kind of the fear of getting big and bulky if you lift heavy weights, right? That's kind of like that generalization that some women, and I feel like it's still out there, that lifting heavy is going to cause you to get bulky and all that and put on like tons and tons of muscle in like 2 weeks or whatever. But that's just really not true, right? Like we know that, building muscle and quote unquote getting bulky, like that is, especially for women, like that takes it takes years to put on a significant amount of muscle, especially if you're more trained. Obviously it depends on how trained you are or not. but it also takes eating enough food. And I think that is a huge piece of it, which we can dive into, like the nutrition aspect. And I think that is one thing that I've seen, because I do work with some males too, as well, over the years. And just from a woman versus male standpoint on like the eating side of things, I think it's a lot easier to convince, just from my side of things, I don't know what you guys think, to convince males to eat a little bit more and go into a muscle building phase and a kind of building phase than it is for women. So sorry, Brian, were you going to say something?
No, you're good. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No, you're good. I thought, okay. But yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things too, is like the nutrition side of things. But looking at the training overall, I think, realizing that lifting heavy is not going to cause you to blow up is the biggest thing to think about. And then also just training in general, and like going back to that whole exercise selection, going back to choosing, movements that are, focused on the specific goal at hand. Getting that adequate stimulus, training with intensity, right? Making sure you have a good enough amount of intensity and intention going into that training session, and, actually doing, not, like we said, not, training just to move from A to B or just to get through your training session, but actually having, intention behind everything you're doing. I think that took me a long time to realize, okay, I'm not just going to go into the gym and, try to get through this training session as fast as I can. I'm going to actually go in and focus on what I'm doing and focus on, mind muscle connection, what I'm actually trying to stimulate and all of that.
So you get videos of your clients doing sets and reps and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you find that most of them, when they come to you, they've already kind of got this ability to train hard?
I would say that it depends on the person. Because I have clients from kind of who are just kind of completely new to training. Then I also have clients who are more advanced. So I think it all just depends how advanced you are, and that would kind of determine that. But I do think that the intensity side of things, if we're talking, I use RIR with all my clients, so reps in reserve, and that's how we gauge intensity. And I think, with everybody, there's probably, and the research shows that not all of us are, we think we're at a certain RIR, but we're not. And so I think that is one big thing that takes a lot of kind of pushing and educating on that standpoint. And yeah, getting close to failure and training, close to failure, or in some regards to failure, at certain points, but then also realizing that, like I said, I work with a lot of women who are type A. So if I tell them to go to failure on certain exercises, it's okay, that they think it's let's go to failure for the next 4 weeks on every single exercise. Because it's if I'm doing this, yeah. So that's, yeah. So.
Yeah, it's all very individual for sure. Aaron, any thoughts?
So with one thing I wanted to kind of back up just a little bit on, so the whole this literally this malconceived notion of if I lift hard, I'm just gonna, all this muscle's just gonna appear on my frame, right? There's this fear, and it's funny because I agree with you. I feel as a society, right, is a fitness population, we're slowly moving away from it, but you still hear it. And I wonder, where did it come from? I know nobody has a friend who just fucked around and lifted a couple weights and blew up. It does not happen. But there's that fear is still it's still prevalent, and you see, I've seen it, and this was something funny. I was telling my girlfriend, Jenny, that we were having, on the show today, and things to talk about. And that was something that she said when we started training together, that was a notion that she had. She realized that I trained so much harder than she thought she was supposed to. And it's one of those things, obviously there's the harder you train, right, the potential for risk is a little bit higher because you're closer to proximity to failure. But that's why we use technical failure, and we're not pushing it on a back squat, right? But it's one of those things, I'm glad we're moving away from it, but I still wonder where these fears come from, because no one has a friend that lifted a couple times and put on 20 pounds of muscle. It just doesn't happen. So I guess, what are some of the things, as a female coach, right, in the industry, working with a lot of other women, what are some of the things you're the tides that are starting to shift a little bit that you see specifically around that, that fear is falling by the wayside?
Yeah. So I think a big part of it is just just everybody in general is kind of moving towards like more educate. I think it's becoming more mainstream too, like for women to see, you know, more women lifting weights and lifting heavy. And like, you know, if you are on like Instagram is kind of good and bad in that in different senses. But if you are on Instagram, you're following someone who is lifting heavy. You're like, oh, they're doing that. And, you know, maybe they don't look super bulky, right? Or whatever it may be. Like, so you're like, oh, okay. So they're probably doing something like good, right? So maybe I need to do that. So I think that's one thing, like just more social media could be like, we know that it can be a good and a bad thing, but I think that's the good side of it, like more access to seeing that and seeing more women like lifting weights and that side of things. I think just more like education in general around like lifting weights and versus cardio training and all of that. I think that's one of the biggest things that I am trying to help get across like in this industry, and especially with I know you know Ashley Van Houten. We put together the Muscle Science for Women program, which is basically kind of our goal was to, you know, teach and educate women on, you know, building muscle. And you know, with that too is kind of the nutrition side of things. And there's a lot of like in terms of women and nutrition, we have a lot of women just so focused on the dieting side of things and the fat loss side of things. And, you know, a lot of women, and I think I have like 1 in every 2 clients come to me and they're like, I want to look toned, right? I want to look toned. And I'm like, okay, well, do you know what you have to do to get there? And they're like, I need to, you know, eat less and do cardio. Like, okay, well, no. What does toned mean, right? Like, what does that mean? It means, you know, looking like you have, you know, nice shoulders, like arms that are quote unquote toned. That's muscle that's causing that tone. Okay, so we need to build some muscle, but okay, how do we do that? No, we can't just be eating as minimal as possible and being afraid to see that scale number go up a little bit. We have to actually be intentional about what we're doing. And so you know, we can go through the nutrition side of things, but that's one of the biggest things I think is hopefully changing, is just like getting women to realize that we don't need to be eating like a 5-year-old child. And really like nourishing and, you know, we can't build muscle from nothing. You have to have the building blocks, or you have to have your nutrition on point, your recovery on point. And you have to be eating enough to facilitate that muscle growth, and maybe going into a building phase and going through that kind of cycle is going to be important for most women. They need that. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I've seen and that I'm trying to help work with my clients and just in general with our Muscle Science for Women program.
Yeah, I really like that. So one thing that we kind of wanted to pivot a little bit with that, because you brought it up with specifically nutrition and some of the things that women, you know, may be doing when they come to you. So in terms of like nutrition, do you so I remember we saw that you had briefly had like some experience in the past with intermittent fasting and IF. Could you just elaborate a little bit with that? And is that something that you're currently doing? Is that something you would recommend, you know, clients to do? Or would has your current nutrition education and implementation changed over time? Can you just take me through a little bit of your like process, not necessarily process, but maybe journey. Journey's the perfect word. Thank you, Brian, through that.
Yeah, for sure. So like I mentioned in the beginning, I kind of got into the keto low carb space, kind of went down that rabbit hole for a while. And there was some things that I loved about it, some things that worked for me in terms of a lot of like the mental clarity side of, you know, keto and lower carb, kind of less food focus. And so that side of things helped me a lot. And also getting into fasting a little bit and getting more into that side of things. And then eventually I got to the point where I was like, okay, like I said, doing more is better, right? That's what I thought. So kind of going down that fasting rabbit hole and doing more and having the negative effects of that. That's what I see with a lot of women that I work with. It's like, you know, fasting can be good to some degree in certain instances, but it also depends a lot on their overall stress load and where they're at in that sense. But with nutrition, I think that, especially with fasting, and I think it also comes back to like the primary goal. So like looking at the primary goal, and like if you are someone who's coming from a place where you do have a significant amount of body fat, like that you need to lose, right? If you are overweight or obese in that realm, and you do have a significant amount that you need to lose, fasting can be a great tool. But if we're talking about building muscle, and we're talking about a woman who is already pretty lean, like probably maybe a little bit of like light fasting, I call it. Maybe you're doing just like a simple like 12 or 14 hour fast, which is just overnight, right? And you're giving your digestion a break. That can be super beneficial in that realm. But if the goal is to build as much muscle as possible and optimize that, then fasting probably doesn't have too much of a place in that, especially with women, because it's just like, we need to get away from that restrictive mindset when we're going like looking to build muscle and looking to optimize that, and get more into that kind of like flipping our mindset to like, okay, I need to eat this food to nourish my body, to recover, to see that muscle growth actually happen. So for me, it was definitely getting out of that scarcity mindset and kind of more in that restrictive mindset, and more so, okay, like, what am I doing in my training, and what's going to support that with my nutrition? And so also kind of thinking, and this can be more so for the advanced people, but also thinking like, what training are you doing right now? Like, are you in a pure hypertrophy stage? Are you in a pure strength phase? Are you in a metabolic phase? Like, there's going to be different kind of tweaks that you can make to your specific nutrition within that. So for example, right now I am in a metabolic phase, with my coach. So I'm having more carbs than I would if I was in a strength phase. And that's just to kind of support that glycolytic side of things. So yeah, I would say that I think for me, it just came back to just educating myself on all of these things and just learning along the way, and kind of testing different things out. But in general, I think that with women, when the goal is to build muscle, like, we just need to get away from that kind of restrictive mindset, and more so focus on, getting at least like in maintenance, like get to maintenance or in a slight surplus. Obviously a slight surplus or surplus is going to be most advantageous, but like, get out of the dieting mindset, get out of that deficit, spend time in maintenance or in a slight surplus, and, be okay with seeing the scale go up, right? That's one thing something that everybody, I think, has, not just with women, but everybody, that can be a little bit scary, like watching the scale number go up. But with a lot of women and with myself, like it took me time to accept that. But when we're looking to build muscle, like, that's not just going to pop out of nowhere, right? Like, muscle it weighs something, right? So if your goal is to build muscle, like, you should be seeing the scale go up. And if the scale is not going up, then you're yes, we can go into body recomposition and all of that. But you should see that scale go up a little bit if your main goal is to build muscle. So that's what I would say is probably, I don't even remember the original question because I just continue to ramble on. So I'm going to shut up. But yeah.
No, that's good. Yeah, go for it, Straker.
Okay. I had to follow up on that. Were you going to follow up too, Brian?
I was going to follow up, but I think you can follow up first.
Okay, so I'll follow up and then you'll follow up. So one thing, especially when you said especially women, right, being afraid of seeing the scale go up, like, what are some of the methods or things that you use to help kind of like, quell those fears, or show or demonstrate to them that it's actually like a positive that the scale's going up? It's not always supposed to go down. Or is there anything that you help them focus on, or maybe ask them questions or anything like that to kind of change the focus to be so heavily on the scale? Because that's, traditionally been a very, large detriment, I think, to a lot of people in this, in their endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So I would say the first thing, like, if I'm taking a client through a building phase, right, I think the first thing is just kind of taking a step back and looking at the overall periodization of where we're trying to go, and kind of laying that out for them, saying like, okay, so let's look at the next year, and your goals, you're already, like, I'm just taking a client, for example, like, you're already pretty lean, and like, you came to me, and you've been quote unquote dieting and in a deficit for a while. Like, we need to transition you out of that. Like, if you want to change your physique, if you want to kind of get that toned look, we can't continue to just diet. We need to put on some more muscle, right? And so kind of taking them through that periodization, saying, okay, like maybe like let's kind of look at the next year. Let's go into this building phase for the next 5 to 6 months. Explaining to them that that is necessary to go into that for a longer period of time, like probably minimum 5 months, maybe 4 months, but that it takes time, right? And then, okay, we'll, transition into maybe going into a cut for 3 months and then practicing maintenance and like taking them through the whole periodization of what that looks like so they kind of understand the timeline. I think that's one of the biggest things to actually bring a client through, because then it shows them like, okay, this is where we're going, right? I'm not just going to put you into a surplus for forever, right? There's going to be some stages to this. So I think that's one of the biggest things. And then just like tracking different things, like tracking, different metrics besides the scale, right? So hammering it into their head that yes, the scale, if we're going into a building phase, the scale should be going up, right? Typically, we're going to be tracking that on a weekly basis, their weekly averages, their biweekly averages, and kind of see that trend up. But we're also going to be tracking their performance, right? And how their performance is going, because that's, I think, the biggest thing. And that's what I try to get across to a lot of my clients. It's like, okay, it's going to be mentally hard to accept that the scale is going up. You're going to feel fluffy. I guess that's a word that I use that word. You're going to feel fluffy at sometimes. You're not going to have, the best body image on some days. Like you're going to feel like, maybe your friend looks super lean and you're just here kind of looking fluffy. Like those thoughts and those feelings are going to occur. So let's prepare you for those, right? Let's like do what we can to prepare you and, work with a coach or someone to help work you through that. So I think that's a big side of things. And then just taking away from the aesthetics focus when you're in a building phase and really, really focusing on other metrics and focusing on kind of progressing with that. So you're obviously in a building phase, like we want your performance to go up. We want your strength to go up. So let's focus on that. Let's, set some goals within this phase that are not aesthetic based, that are more so performance based or maybe mentality based, right? So it's just kind of picking those different goals that are away from the aesthetic side of things. And then just kind of trying to convince them that, building muscle takes time, right? And so being patient and being consistent, and not going into, like, I think one of the biggest things is also like telling them, hey, like, are you like really finding out if they're committed to it? Because there are times when I've had clients go into a quote unquote building phase and we're like a month in and it's like, oh man, like the scale's up and I don't feel good. So I just want to go back into a cut. And it's like, it's only been a month. So we really need to get that mindset right. And just, I think working with someone that can really help just to, guide you along the way and have someone in your, kind of there to help, I guess.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I think you covered that really well.
I feel like I'm rambling, so I'm sorry. Feel free to cut me off.
No, Brian, you had a follow-up to that?
I'm not going to follow up, but I am going to ask a different question that I'm curious about. Can you tell me about what you found in your Masters Thesis in the keto diet for CrossFit athletes and discuss that just briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So with that study, I always preface that it was in non-elite CrossFit athletes. So it was just kind of like your average Joe going to CrossFit. Their main goal was actually to lose body fat, right? So performance was not the main goal. Okay. CrossFit was just their style of exercise, right? So we had about like 32 participants, I believe, and we divided them into a control group, which is just standard American diet, and a keto group. And, basically it was a 6-week study. And, after the 6 weeks, we saw that the participants in the ketogenic diet group were able to lose a statistically significant amount of body fat compared to those in the standard American diet group, while increasing their performance to the same degree. These stats were also on average too, so we have to kind of take that into account, right, with statistics and studies and things like that. Sure. But the biggest thing with that is that I do, and I know you guys know this, is a lot of a lot of people in kind of the space, kind of, especially if you haven't done CrossFit before, like we're like, you can't do keto, you can't do low carb because CrossFit is a highly glycolytic sport. That is true in some sense, but if we're looking at the average person going to CrossFit, right? The average person going to CrossFit gym and looking at an average workout, right? So I know, at least for me and for a lot of the, CrossFit gyms that I've been to, it's an hour-long workout, right? Maybe 10 minutes of that workout is that 10 to 15 is that glycolytic stage,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
The first, I need to take a sip of water. I'm clearly talking too much, so I'm losing my voice. The first 30 to 45 minutes of that hour workout is the skill and strength based, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, there's a glycolytic side of it. And yes, if you look at the CrossFit Games, that's a whole different story. But we're talking about your average person who goes to CrossFit looking to just, have that community atmosphere. Maybe they are a little overweight and they're looking to lose some body fat, right. And they're just using that to get a little bit of sweat on. So I think that's one of the biggest things to kind of preface with that. But those were the results that came out of that study. Would I say right now, if I have a client coming to me, especially a female client who is already kind of on the leaner side, and they're doing CrossFit, would I put them on a strict ketogenic diet? Probably, absolutely not. Just from what I've learned and the mistakes that I've made, and I think that keto can be a great tool in certain scenarios, but it really just comes back to kind of where that person is, what their goals are, what their overall stress load is for their lifestyle, because I think that's something that a lot of people miss out on. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
No, it's so super interesting. I had a feeling that the result was going to be that it helped if the goal was weight loss. And I remember you put non-elite into the description when you mentioned it earlier. So I was just really curious on it because, up until about that time, 2016, 17, keto was kind of the accepted way, paleo or whatever was the accepted way of eating for CrossFit. And then it was right around the time that you did that study that it was kind of shifting and people were like, oh, it's a glycolytic sport. You need carbs, right? So it was an odd timing for you to have that study and to get that result. But then the non-elite kind of buffers that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
I think it was, it's a word there you used, Brian, accepted method of eating. And I think I would even kind of kick that up a notch and say it was the suggested method. Right. But again, and what kind of tying it back to what a few things that we have kind of asked you questions, Rachel, and you answered them very, very well and saying it's contextual dependent based on an individual, right? And with that, kind of when paleo was super big and pushed from HQ, it kind of missed the mark for your standard American. Yes, that is fantastic, getting them into the gym type of deal. But then people like you, Brian, people like me, because I remember those days, we extrapolated that and we want to push, we want to train really, really hard in CrossFit and we want to be the best. And, carbs are the devil and type of stuff. All I need to fuel my workout is black coffee and bacon. And we couldn't have been further from the truth. And then I think it was around that same time, you were saying that 2016, 2017, where you had that first, maybe second generation of your CrossFit crowd. And that's what I would consider myself in that second generation. Our bodies were starting to break down from that specifically, or a combination of things, obviously training way too much, not fueling ourselves aptly, cortisol through the roof, all that sort of thing. And then we were kind of oh, this might not be best for CrossFit of sport type of deal. Mm-hmm. So it is kind of cool to see how that's transitioned. And then one thing I wanted to ask you, Rachel, is as you have gone through your journey as a coach and as a coach athlete, right? That's we're all, I would still consider athletes. What are some of the things where you're finding in your own journey where you're kind of approaching the apex of a new kind of level of knowledge, or things that you're beginning to uncover or see more now that you're quite not super grasp on yet, but you're beginning to what is your time getting right now in terms of learning more is basically what I'm asking.
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing right now that I'm just super interested in is the training side of things. I think with nutrition, I've definitely learned a lot, and I think it's not that I can't stop learning the nutrition side of things, but I think there does come to a point where it's maybe not that I've learned all that I can, but there's things are not changing that much in terms of all of the things that I've learned over the years and all the mistakes I've made and learned from that. And then the clients that I'm working with, I think the nutrition side of things, just realizing that working with different types of clients, everybody's just so individual in that sense. But with the training side of things, I just feel it's just it's never ending. Like there's so much. So that's what I'm just like super nerding out on right now, is just like getting into like all the N1 stuff. Like that stuff is super interesting to me, and just going into like you were kind of joking about like shorten versus lengthen, and like, does that matter? Like, you know, 2 years ago, I'd be like, what the heck are you talking about? So that side of things I just think is super interesting. But I also think, you know, there is a point where it gets super, super advanced in that sense. But I think the more advanced you can get, the more you're able to kind of break things down for someone who might not even be training, or might not even be advanced in training, they're newer, right? So I think with the training side of things, that's something that I've been spending a lot of time on. And it just interests me. So I like to geek out on that.
Are the physique development guys, they're pretty much all N1 based in methodology, right?
Yeah, because Austin Current, Alex Bush, and Sue Bush. So Austin came from N1, I believe, or he works with them. So yeah.
He worked with them,
yeah. So I think a lot of their style of training is the same.
Okay.
So.
Very cool. Well, next time you're out in the Colorado area, we'll have to try and get a session at the HQ there, because I know you came like 6 months ago or a year ago, right?
Yeah. I was in Boulder a few months ago for some business stuff. Yeah.
Cool.
I know we're kind of coming up on our time here shortly, but Rachel, I have one more question for you that I want to kind of wrap this up with. So with our overall theme of building muscle for women, if you had to break down, like, what are your, maybe let's do 3, right? Because it's pretty tangible. What would you say are like the top 3 considerations that you would want, like if they're, a woman who's out there listening to this episode, to consider and apply objectively into her training, nutrition, etc., for pursuit of hypertrophy?
Sure. So top 3. I think
maybe the top 3 mistakes or something like that. Like the real tangible bite-sized ones.
So I would say the first thing is just overall, like starting with the nutrition side of things. I'll just take that standpoint. Like I said, making sure that you're fueling appropriately and eating enough in general. I think protein is one of the biggest things. Like all of the clients that I work with, when they come to me, no matter what type of diet style they're coming from, they tend to be very much under eating protein. And so obviously if the goal is to build muscle and to recover properly, like we need to get that protein up. So that's kind of one of the main mistakes I would say, is just overall eating enough food in terms of calories. But I think protein is the biggest thing there. And then obviously leveraging, carbs depending on where you're at and what works within your training, your lifestyle, and kind of not fearing, certain macronutrients and realizing that they all have a place in what you're doing. So that would be probably number 1. Number 2, I kind of already alluded to this, but the recovery side of things, like just, realizing that doing more is not always better. There's a difference between doing hard work and being overworked, right? So realizing that can have a huge detriment to what you're doing in terms of working really, really hard in the gym and not seeing the results from that. I spent a lot of time doing that. And I have a lot of women that are doing that too. They just, whether it's doing too much cardio or just training too much in general, and just not giving yourself enough time to recover and rebuild. Because like we said, exercise to build, that's another one. Exercise to build, not to lose. So focusing on the cardio aspect of things, but also realizing that, muscles aren't built in the gym. They're broken down in the gym. They're built during that recovery side of things. And then with that overall stress load, just in general, that kind of goes with that one, just like kind of looking at your overall lifestyle, and like stress and recovery is not just, the days that you take off from the gym, but it's also like how you're recovering in other aspects of your life. So like, what's your stress management like? What's your sleep like? What's your quality of sleep like? All these things matter, and all these things play a role in your ability to recover. So I guess that could all be kind of the recovery side of things. What else? Number 3, I don't know. It's so hard to choose. What did I say? Nutrition,
recovery.
Nutrition, recovery.
Give us a training one. We need a training
one.
One.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with training, putting your ego aside is one thing. And I think with ego, we have different facets to that too. It's like, we kind of let our ego control things sometimes. So whether it's going to the gym and feeling like you need to lift heavier, feel maybe your like lack of confidence is a big thing with a lot of women. So kind of just setting your ego aside and saying like, all right, let's focus on what I'm here to do. Let's not, worry about who's, next to me or, getting on my phone during my session or like whatever it may be, like how you look in the mirror and blah, 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 blah. So putting that aside, and then also just in terms of training, like making sure that you are training for your specific goal, like making sure that you are, if your goal is to build muscle, like you need to be training in a way that you are stimulating that muscle, that you're setting yourself up to execute the exercise properly, that you are, have intention behind your training, and that you're focusing on not just moving things from A to B, right? You're focusing on actually stimulating what you're trying to stimulate. You're actually putting intention behind that. And you're not just trying to quote unquote get through the session as fast as possible. So I think that would be probably one of the biggest things in training.
I love those. Those are 3 really good ways to sum it up, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's so interesting when you talk to, because it really is very dependent upon who you're talking to, like who your audience is. So it seems like when you talk, you're talking a lot of times to that like type A, like ex-CrossFitter that pushes so hard. And then there's the other person who's the person that like doesn't push hard enough. And I never find myself talking to that person either. I always seem to do it more like the way you do, where we're trying to like reel people back in. So it's interesting when you think about it though, because the way you approach it is completely different based on the audience that you're speaking to. Anyways, thanks so much for coming on. Tell all of the people where they can find you and learn more about you.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a podcast myself. It's called MetFlex and Chill. My website has my podcast, has all my programs on it. It's metflexlife.com. We have the Muscle Science for Women program. We just went through the first round back in April is when it started. So we're probably going to be gearing up for another round of that. Not exactly sure when, but if anybody's interested to learn more about that program, that's on my website. It's metflexlife.com/MSW. You can sign up, for the waiting list. And then on Instagram is probably where I'm most active. So my handle's at rachelgregory.cns.
Awesome. I'm going to link all that stuff up in the show notes. And for the listeners out there, Rachel has a fantastic protein powder based ice cream recipe on that website. I use it periodically myself. I'll send it to clients. I'll put that in the show notes as well. That one is definitely one of my favorites when you want to just, it's like kind of guilt-free, as outrageous as it kind of sounds, but it's pretty damn decent on top of it too.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Thanks.
So
Thanks,
thank
Rachel.
you. Yeah, thank you for coming on the show, Rachel. Everyone out there, thank you for listening as always. Brian and I will talk to you next week.